Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's topic is going to be how reliable is the Torath Mosheh Masorath. Now, this question came about as a part of a forum that I've been trying my best to recently get off of, just to spend more time doing other things. And there's a challenge that came up mostly from people who are Christian. When I presented this idea that Christians, for example, have a standard that they use to determine what they believe in, for better or for worse, and it's not comparable to, and it's not equated to, and can't be equated to, the standard of Torath Mosheh that is held by Torah-based Jews, whether it be Torath Mosheh Jews or Orthodox Jews, which essentially, as I've mentioned before, are pretty much the same thing, just some cultural differences because of where Orthodoxy came from in Europe, but it's basically like just a type of Torath Mosheh. And I wanted to try it in this video to find a way to explain visually exactly what I mean by that, and also to respond to this person's challenges as well as questions. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, buckle up, buckle in, because this is going to be something where I'm going to need to go into a lot of detail, and I also get really excited about the topics. I may get a little so into it that I may go a little faster than I normally would, but I'm going to try to keep this as slow as possible. So a question that someone could ask is, first and foremost, what is a Masorath? So I've dealt with this in previous videos, but let's go over it again just so it's understood. A Masorath is a type of singularity event. It's a text, it's a chain of transmission, and it's also the people who transmitted it. Now, I know that doesn't really explain the question for some, or explain the answer in a way that people will understand it. So here, let's go this way. One of the things that Rabbi Steinholtz, of blessed memory, mentioned in his Talmudic reference guide is that each generation received knowledge of divine revelation and passed it on to the next. He's talking about Jewish generations from the time when the Torah was given until the present era. Some things were written down and others remained in oral tradition. Certain things were exceedingly hard to explain either orally or in writing and had to be taken as axiomatic. The sum of one generation's knowledge of revelation is known as the Torah of that generation, and its transmission to the following generation is the well-known Shalshelet Kabbalah, chain of tradition. Now, this may seem weird because you're probably looking at this video and didn't expect it to be, in a sense, a science class. But I put this here for a specific reason, because essentially, as you've heard in other videos, when we talk about Hashem, the way that you could probably translate Hashem into English is to say that Hashem is the source of creation. So essentially, the source of creation, of course, had the ability to create, if you will, cause a universe to exist, cause reality to exist, and all the possibilities of reality. So if we take that as a starting point, and say that there's a being that has the ability to create everything, and and even if you say it's not a being, it's just something beyond humanity, if you will, that caused there to be the reality that we exist in. Some people's language, it may be the Big Bang, whatever you want to call it. This is the starting point in the singularity of Torath Mosheh, and also would be the singularity of Masorath, and also how we would determine whether or not, throughout the history from when the Torah was given until now, whether or not Israelis and Jews have kept the text, the practices, and the procedures correct. So in order to investigate this, we have to have a method, because one of the challenges you face when people bring these kind of issues up and try to pretend is if they say, oh, I don't believe in that, and you find out that they do believe it in some way, but they're just trying to argue with the Jewish understanding and the Jewish practices, and also the Jewish rejection of other practices of other religions and things like that. Well, the first thing is, we're going to research something. You have to have a method of research. When you research history, when you check to see if something happened in history, you don't just simply throw it into the wind and just say, okay, I accept that this happened and this didn't happen. You have to have a method. So I think there's a website called History Detectives, has a pretty good summary of some of the methodologies that a person can use for this type of research, and I've listed them here. And essentially, one of the basics are, first of all, define the objective. And you can kind of read through and see what they mean by that. Consider the end product, set limits, understand the context, know where to look, ask for resource suggestions, get organized, remember what you are doing, do it right, consider the quality, and keep in touch. Now, again, you can look at their website, and I'll try to put it in the description portion of the video, below the video. But essentially what it means is that when you're looking into history, you have to say, well, first of all, what's the objective? What am I trying to investigate? And this objective, we're trying to understand whether or not, it can be said that Jews have kept the Torah correctly from the time it was given at Mount Sinai until the present era. Well, we have to consider what the end product would be. The end product, of course, would be that we were able to show that there has been, a continuous procedure and process of transmitting the Torah-based information. We've already defined what it is. It isn't just the text itself. It's also the people and the practices around it, and also the claim of the source that it came from. So we'd have to understand that and set our limits. We have to know and say, okay, well, everything under the sun doesn't prove that the Torah is correct or not. Everything under the sun doesn't disprove it. So there has to be something that is like set, meaning that I accept this information as a methodology of proof, and I don't accept this as proof. And here's the thing. Everybody's level of proof may be different. But I've already set those things, and this is the way I'm setting them. So this is the way that we look forward to that. Know where to look. For example, we're not going to go to, uninhabited island to look for Torah text and say, the Torah is wrong because there's none here at this island. At the same time, we're not going to assume that because of the fact that there's some Jews sitting here right now today that the text is accurate from several thousand years ago. We have to know where to look for that kind of information. We have to maybe do some digging. We have to look around in text. And here's the other thing. We may have to learn a language or two in order to determine whether or not, what is the situation. The same thing, ask for resource suggestions. We look into, other people who've looked into this issue. We get organized and so on and so on. So, looking at another source from, I think it's from Eth Cohen, the ECU, it's an Australian site. They had a really good piece about what, is historical research. And essentially, historical research or histography attempts to systematically recapture the complex nuances, the people, meanings, events, and even ideas, concerning history. And, it's going a little bit faster than I thought it was, but historical research relies on a wide variety of sources, both primary and secondary. And they give an explanation of what primary sources are, which are like eyewitness accounts, events, oral and written testimonies, records that are found. And then they also deal the same thing in terms of what are secondary sources. And they also give the steps for historical research, similar to what was always already provided. And they, provide these based upon other sources. So what this means is that you have to have a method when you're investigating history. And this is one of the things with the person who basically influenced this topic. They were simply just, kind of, in my opinion, just throwing things out there. And not using the methodologies that would help to discover whether the, what is being expressed is true or not. Because again, I could be wrong. Everything I put on these videos could be completely wrong. The issue is if I've done my homework and done the research, and someone else decides they don't have to do research or homework. Well, they can't exactly say, but a person who does the research and looks in the right places can say. So then this brings up the question of how was the first Torah received and transmitted? So if you remember, in previous videos, in several of them, I talked about this issue that the claim, and again, for the moment, we'll say it's a claim. The claim of the Torath Mosheh community of Torah-based Jews is that at some point, several thousand years ago, there was a singularity that happened, where the creator of all things caused a situation where the people who called at that time Bnei Yisrael, and also an Erev Rov, who were mixed multitude from Mitzrayim, to leave Mitzrayim under very difficult conditions for the Mitzrayim, for the Egyptians at that time, and brought them to a mountain called Har Sinai or Horev. And at that mountain, the singularity spoke 10 things, which various Jewish sources of the people who were there say that they either both heard, depending on where they were, and also mentally where they were, and also they saw. So they saw the words of the Creator being written in the air like either fire or lightning, and they also heard it. So you have millions of people who are there and see this event. And it wasn't just like Moses goes up to the mountain and says, okay, you're going to hear the voice of the Creator. And Moses goes and hides somewhere and it's yelling, okay, you people, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Ani hotzeti etchem me'eretz Yisrael. Like, hey, where's Moshe? Where's Moshe ben Amram? This sounds like his voice. This is a situation where he was right there with them. And then the people heard the Creator speaking and saw the words and saw the mountain, saw the fire and saw these events happening. And essentially they ran, for a distance and told eventually Moshe ben Amram, you go talk to the Creator. We'll stay back here. You just tell us what he said, because that was all too much. And essentially what you had is that over a 40-year period of them being in the Midbar, heading towards the land of Israel, this wasn't just the one event that happened. There are a number of events happened, including the one that happened previous with the leaving of Egypt at the time, that basically forged a national identity. And that national identity, was one of the, if you will, ways to identify this event that we're talking about, and also one of the ways to identify the text and the correct meaning of it. Now, further to that, the Torah explains, and also through Jewish oral histories and Jewish tradition explains that before Moshe ben Amram passed away, he was the one who brought, through, with the Creator, of course, leading him to the people to Mount Sinai and through the Midbar. Before he passed away, before the people went into the land of Israel, he essentially was told by the Creator to write a text, and essentially to write what's called the Torah. From start to finish, what exactly the Creator gave him, meaning that the Creator told him to write this word, he wrote that word. The Creator told him to make a space right there, he made a space. Lengthen that letter right there, he lengthened it. Put a big gap there, the gap was there. Spell the word this way, the word spelled that way. Leave this part, like that, don't explain it any further. He didn't explain any further. And essentially what he did was from start to finish, he wrote one Torah scroll. He wrote it on a type of material that we mentioned in the previous video called Gawil, or Jawil. And essentially that's basically where you take a hide of an animal and use the whole hide. It looks like leather essentially. And that's what he wrote on using a very special ink, which is still used to this day, meaning the ingredients for the ink are still made in the same way that it was done several thousand years ago. And we'll see that further on as we discuss these topics. And from there, he made 12 copies of that Torah scroll. Now, here's the thing that has to be remembered. Essentially, when writing a Torah scroll, and this right here is not an actual Torah scroll, this is what's called Megillat Esther, but the same process used for writing Megillat Esther is used for writing a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll. So essentially, there's no point in the Torah, in the writing of the Torah, where Moshe ben Amram was allowed to write what he thought or write what he wanted, because again, taking this as we mentioned earlier, the Creator of all things is telling him what to write. So it's a little hard to change something when you have the source of creation telling you what to write, and when you've already chosen to do whatever the source of creation tells you to do. And people saw it. So for example, he would not in that situation act on his own because of the fact that the source of creation is there as the check and balance of that generation to what is being recorded. And also, here's the important point. Moshe ben Amram was chosen for a reason. He was chosen because of the fact that he was the type of person who would meticulously sit down and do exactly what the Creator wanted, and also write what the Creator required for him to do. So at the end of all things, as you will, the Torah scroll essentially would be something like this. So from right to left is how we read Hebrew. So essentially throughout an entire this entire period, Moshe ben Amram was writing and writing and writing, and everything that the Creator told him to write, and every space that was there, exactly like how the lines are supposed to be placed and things like that, produced a Torah scroll. And then from there he made copies of that Torah scroll. So, giving an example of how a Torah scroll, would have looked in that time, based upon Jewish information passed on from that time, these are examples of what he would have had at the end of the day. At the end of the day, he would have had a text that was a copy of another text that he made based upon what the Creator was telling him. And again, this is the Creator of all things choosing someone who would be dedicated to doing this work, and also the Creator of all things giving it to him in whatever form he gave it to him. Visually, mentally, orally, in a way where Moshe Rabbeinu was sitting and writing it out. And from there, he basically made 12 copies of that Torah. And one of the copies was placed in the Aron, which is like I think they call it the Ark in Hebrew, the Ark of the Covenant, if you will, and was given to the Kohanim, the priests, and also the Levim, who managed the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and eventually later the Bet HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. Now, what's important to note is that these texts that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote were the prototype of the Sefer Torah, the official Torah scroll. And the guidance and the instruction that he had given, in writing was one thing, but then orally, he had given instructions on how to make copies of this text. Meaning that, as I mentioned in the previous video, there are rules and regulations about who can even transcribe them, because it's not that they're writing them, they're copying them. What kind of, what text am I able to use to copy them? Of course, at the beginning of this time, it would have had to have been a Torah scroll that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. So someone says, well, I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram, all of these things. No, that's not acceptable. The Torah scrolls that he wrote are the ones we start with. So this is the baseline. The Sefer Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote was the baseline. So your next question may be, who transmitted the text and its understanding throughout the generations? Now, in order to understand this point, we would first have to go back to what we mentioned in the previous video of what exactly is a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah, as it's called in Hebrew. What does it consist of? Well, first of all, as we mentioned before, it consists of 5 different sections of the text, and basically they're all sewn together, as I showed in the previous video. But essentially, it would be Bereshith, which is also known as Genesis in English for English Bibles, Shemoth, which is known as Exodus in the English Bibles, Vayigoro, which is known as always the English names sometimes are tricky for me, Leviticus, and then also Bemidbar, which in English would be Numbers, and the Vorim, which would be Deuteronomy in English. These components make up the Torah, and they're actually in the order I just read them to you. That's the order that they must show up in a kosher Sefer Torah. I'll repeat that again. The order I just gave you, Bereshith, Shemot, Vayikro, Bemidbar, the Vorim, those sections have to be in order from right to left of the Torah, from start to finish in that order. Anything out of order is not kosher, and it wouldn't be used by a Jew. If someone showed up to a synagogue and saw a synagogue where they had Devorim first, Shemot second, Bimidbar third, immediately he would not read from that Torah scroll and would actually leave that Bet Knesset and not come back, because it's known that that's not the order that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it in. And also, the Creator of all things chose the right people in order to take this on very seriously. So let's investigate this. Now for the next few slides, I'm going to be using examples. These pictures are not actually pictures of someone from several thousand years ago. Essentially, these are pictures of Jews from the last about 100 years ago, 100 years or so, that I'm using as examples because of the fact that these are Jews from Jewish communities that have had traditions that can be traced back to the way people did things thousands of years ago. So every picture you're going to see is of a Jew who was living and dressing in a way before the state of Israel, in a similar way, based upon what we know about peoples and histories and locations and geography, to the way people were doing things going back several thousand years ago. So let's say that this is our example of Moshe ben Amram. Moshe ben Amram is the one who led the people of the Bnei Israel and the Erev Rob out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, to Har Sinai, received the Torah. The people said, Moshe Rabbeinu, you go get the rest of the Torah from the Creator. We'll stay down here. You get it. Moshe Rabbeinu goes and gets it. For 40 years, he's teaching the people Torah. And then when the generation that's about to enter the land of Israel, which he was not one of them, was entering, he wrote down Torah scrolls in order to give to that generation. So our Jewish and also, interestingly enough, Samaritan histories claim that when Moshe Rabbeinu made that first Torah, he made copies of it. So that means that he sat down, wrote the first one, which you see in the middle, then he made another one, he transcribed it again, he transcribed it again, so on and so on, until essentially there were 13 Torah scrolls. And then from there, what he did was he gave Torah, first of all, to the Leviim, to the Kohanim, that was going to be kept in the most central place of the Jewish people, which was the tabernacle or the Mishkan, and then later in the temple in Jerusalem. And that copy that he started with, the first one he made, was that copy that he gave to them. But then he gave copies to each of the leaders of the different 12 tribes. So that means that each leader of the 12 tribes received a Torah scroll from Moshe Rabbeinu. And from there, people made copies from his copy, and people made copies from those copies. And because of the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram, had established what the rules were for transcribing these, for copying these, that means that anything that was used as an official Torah scroll had to meet those rules. Anything that didn't meet those rules it was not an official Torah scroll. It may have been a personal Torah scroll, but it's not something that could be used officially in front of other Jews. And we'll see later of how these things were back-checked. So the next step in the lineage, if you will, of the Torah scroll is that there was a man by the name of Yehoshua ben Nun, who was a Jew from the tribe of Ephraim, who had learned from Moshe Rabbeinu. He was, in English you would know it as Joshua, but his name was Yehoshua ben Nun. And essentially he had been a student of Moshe Rabbeinu. So he, after Moshe Rabbeinu, before Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, had been, set upon as being the leader of the Bnei Israel, who were about to enter into the land of Israel when Moshe Rabbeinu would pass away. He was basically instructed by Moshe ben Amram publicly and also personally. And then before Moshe ben Amram passed away, he was basically initiated into this leadership position in front of the entire people. So it wasn't like someone says, wait a minute, how did Yehoshua ben Nun become the leader all of a sudden? When did that happen? I wasn't there. Nope, it was done in front of the people publicly so that everybody would see that he was a leader. And everyone knew him to be a person who learned from Moshe ben Amram, because not only was he learning, everybody else was learning from Moshe ben Amram. So if he had said or done something that was contradictory to what Moshe ben Amram had said, it would have been evident, because people were like, hey, we learned that. We have our own Torah scrolls. That's not what he taught. Yeah, you're the leader of Ephraim, and you're now the king of Am Yisrael, the leader of Am Yisrael, because essentially he was the king of Am Yisrael when he became this leader. That you can't say that. You can't do that. That's not what Moshe ben Amram taught you. And he would have millions of people being able to say, no, we were there also. We saw it for ourselves. Not just me, my father, my uncle, my aunt, my cousins, my brothers, my sisters. Everybody saw it. You can't say that. So essentially, he, by just this process, would be required to do what everybody had already known he had been taught to do. So from his generation, same process. Copies of the Torah are being made. He's making copies of the ones that he received from Moshe Rabbeinu. And in fact, according to Jewish, the Torah law, that he also had to follow, especially him being the leader of Am Yisrael at the time, he had to make himself 2 Sefer Torahs that he had to transcribe himself. And one of the advantages to that is that it causes the leader to have to know what's in the text for himself. If he has to write it out for himself, if he has to copy it by his own hand for himself, he would have to also know what's in there and become an expert in knowing what's in there. So then you get to the next generation, in a sense, that essentially during the time of, near the time that Yehoshua ben Nun was about to pass away, the leaders of that time were known as Shoftim. And also you had Pinchas, who was the grandson of Aharon HaKohen, who was the brother of Moshe Rabbeinu. Those leaders, the Shoftim, at the time would have been, of course, young during the time, either when they came into the land of Israel, or they would have been born in the land of Israel. And essentially many of them would have known Yehoshua ben Nun, as well as Yehoshua ben Nun had his own Bet Din, meaning that he had his own, judicial court, or Mosaic courts, as you've heard me mention in other videos. In every generation, there was a Mosaic court. So his Mosaic court, at the same time, would have been transmitting information to the people. Any questions or conflicts that would have come up about not just the text, but also how to perform the Torah would have been brought to them, and they would have been the supreme court of the Jewish nation, if you will, at the time, the Israeli nation at the time. So the same process happens. Pinchas and the Shoftim make copies of the Torah, from the Torah that had been received from Moshe ben Amram, which would still have been around. As we'll see, as we mentioned in the previous video, that when you write a Torah scroll on Gewil, it actually lasts like a long time. There's been actually copies of Torahs that have lasted about 1,000 years. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on Gewil and written in the same kind of ink, so that they've lasted for more than 2,000 years, especially in a dry desert environment. So what this means that Pinchas would have had, Torahs of his own. The Shoftim, being leaders, would have had to make Torahs of their own, and they still, at this point, would have had the Torahs the Torah scrolls, the 13 Torah scrolls that Moshe ben Amram would have had, and they still would have had the procedures that he gave for who can copy it, how they copy it, and things like that. So then the next step of the puzzle is that there was a leader who was a Kohen by the name of Eli, who also taught Shmuel. Now, for those of you who only know English, may know Shmuel as Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who actually taught King David, but his name was actually Shmuel. So Eli, same process. He learned from the Shoftim. He learned from Pinchas, and essentially the same thing. He, being a leader of the people of the nation at the time, and also being a Kohen, also being in charge of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, he would have had to have copies of the Torah. He would have been making copies of the Torah for himself and for others, and everybody would have been able to make copies of the Torah. Anybody has a conflict, you go to Jerusalem, you go to where the Mishkan is, you ask, okay, let's see what's in the Torah. I'm not sure if this is a mistake or not. You can back check it. By this point, the Torah scrolls that Moshe Rabbeinu had written, the 13, would still have been around because of the fact that they were written on Gewil, and this is only a couple hundred years later. So this still would have been the process. This is only about 2 generations later. These Torah scrolls would have been in circulation, because as we know historically, Gewil can last for more than 1,000 years. So then we get into the time of King David, or David HaMelech, as we say in Hebrew, and his son Shlomo HaMelech, or King Solomon. Essentially, what you have is a situation where David learned from Shmuel. Shmuel learned from Eli. Eli learned from Pinchas, and also the Shoftim of that generation, the Shoftim being the judges of that time. The judges and Pinchas learned from Yehoshua ben Nun, as well as Yehoshua ben Nun's Bet Din of that time. Yehoshua ben Nun learned from Moshe ben Amram. Moshe ben Amram learned from Hashem. Hashem, put this person in charge because of the fact he knew that Moshe ben Amram would be a good person to transmit to it. Yehoshua ben Nun had been told to be the leader to Moshe by Hashem. So Hashem chose that leader because that's who Hashem wanted to be the leader. Same process. David HaMelech, we know, wrote the Psalms, or Tehillim as we call it in Hebrew. So we know that he was always studying Torah. You know, the Tehillim talk a lot about Torah. They talk about how great the Torah is. So he, as a king of the first, the first Davidic, monarchy, also would have been required to make 2 Torah scrolls that he would have had to copy from himself. Where would he have copied from? Well, he would have copied from the most accurate Torahs of the time, which still would have been the ones that Moshe ben Amram had basically made during the time in the Midbar. And essentially, he would have had access to them because he's the king. And in the Bet HaMikdash, the temple at the time, the Mishkan, they still would have had the ability to bring that Torah scroll, and he would have copied from that. So all those copies would have come from that. And David HaMelech had his own Bet Din, meaning a judicial system, a judicial courts. He had a supreme court just like everyone else in the previous generations. He had lower courts. Everybody would have been making copies from those copies of the Torah. And the back checking would have been checking from the previous Torahs. If there was ever a question, you go back to where the temple is, you go back to where the Mishkan is, you go to the Qaraim the Leviim, and you get those Torah scrolls made by Moshe ben Amram. Any problems with those Torahs, you've got lots of time to go back and check them. As we'll see later, the process of checking them is quite simple because of the fact that Torah scrolls are read constantly in Jewish communities, constantly. So in order to shorten the time, because we have a complete list in Jewish communities of who passed on the Torah from each generation up until the Talmudic period. So essentially what we have here is it says, Eliyahu kibel me'achiyah hashilonit be'ubeth dino. So that means that the prophet Elijah, as you say in English, Eliyahu, received the Torah me'achiyah. Achiyah basically learned it from David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech. And then he'll basically, it says that Elisha kibel me'Eliyahu ubeth dino. So each time that we're going to mention somebody in this list, they have a bet din, meaning they have a Mosaic court, a judicial court that also learns Torah and teaches Torah and makes copies of the Sefer Torah. Then Yehoyada HaKohen kibel me'Elisha. So he received the Torah from Elisha and his bet din, ubet dino. Zechariah, or Zechariah, you say in English, received the Torah mi-Yehoyada, ubet dino. So this means that the prophets that are mentioned, that are in the prophetic books of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Tanakh, every single one of them learned Torah from the previous generation of leaders of that time. So since it says that Yehoshua kibel mi-Zechariah, ubet dino. So basically, Hoshea received the Torah from Zechariah. So Zechariah taught Yehoshea the Torah, and also his bet din taught him. When Amos kibel meHoshea ubet dino. So Amos, the prophet Amos, received the Torah from Hoshea and his bet din. So it says where Yeshayahu kibel me'Amos ubet dino, uMicha kibel meYeshayahu ubet dino, uYoel kibel meMicho ubet dino, uNahum kibel meYoel ubet dino, uHabakuk kibel meNahum ubet dino, uTzefanyo kibel meHabakuk ubet dino, uYirmiyahu kibel meTzefanyo ubet dino, uBaruch ben Neriyo kibel meYirmiyahu ubet dino, uEzra uvet dino kiblu mibaruch uvet dino. So the last ones I mentioned were all of the prophets that are considered the minor prophets in the Torah, as well as Zechariah. So basically what we're saying is that the prophet whose name is Yeshayahu received the Torah from Amos and his bet din. And Micha, the prophet, received the Torah from Mishayahu and his bet din. And Yoel received the Torah from Micha and whose bet din. Nahum received the Torah from Yoel and his bet din. The Habakkuk received the Torah from Nahum who in his bet din. Zephaniah, I think in English they say, received the Torah from Habakkuk and his bet din. Then Yirmiyahu, meaning Jeremiah, as you would say in English, received the Torah from Zephaniah ubet dino. And Baruch ben Neriah received the Torah from Yirmiyahu and his bet din. And Ezra the scribe, or in Hebrew we say Ezra Sofer, and his bet din received the Torah from Baruch uvet dino. So that means that in each generation, every single time you see a prophet of Israel mentioned in the text, for those of you who are not Jewish and don't know Hebrew, what you don't realize sometimes is that the Torah that existed was being passed on these prophets. The prophets weren't just popping out of nowhere and just sitting in fields doing nothing at all, and then all of a sudden Hashem tells them to go do something and tell the people that they're messing up. They were Torah scholars. Every single one of them had known the Torah, with maybe the exception of a couple of them, but they weren't the major leaders, the ones who kind of said, look, I don't really know Torah, I'm not really a Chacham, I'm not the son of a Navi, in the time required that somebody be sent in, and you're the guy. So what has to be understood here is that when you mention Ezra, when you mention Jeremiah, when you mention any of these prophets, they would have had Torah scrolls of their own because they had to know Torah in order to be able to tell the people do the Torah correctly. People say, well, what's the Torah? How do we do what you're saying? Here's the Torah and here's the halakha. Here's how we do it. So it isn't just like, they're just saying, hey, you guys are just sinning. What's a sin? Well, the Torah is what determines what's wrong and what's right. Again, as this means is that if you want to put like faces on it, essentially the best faces you can find to say, okay, well, what did those generations look like with the Torah? The best way to do it in a modern sense is to look at any Jew from about prior to 1,000 years ago, especially in the Middle East and North Africa and even in Europe, and say this is an example of how those Israelis, those prophets who were Israelis, who were Jews, would have looked back then. And this is the Torah that they would have kept, and this is the Torah that they transmitted, and this is what they were teaching people to do, and this is what people who did keep the Torah correctly were following. So this brings up a question when people who, let's say, are sometimes Christian or who believe in Hashem, but then they question whether or not the Torah is correct as it is now. So this question is the following. Would Hashem create a universe, give the Torah at Mount Sinai, promise that it would be kept forever by a particular group of people, and then let all the people keep it incorrectly and, drum roll, not put safeguards for it to be kept correctly by at least 10 Jews per Israeli city in every generation in place? So what do I mean by this? What do I mean by this idea that how could Hashem create a universe which is more complex than having people do something like, transcribe something correctly, and create an entire universe, give the Torah, go through all that trouble, and then almost like if you will, go play golf and look back and say, hey, wait a minute, those people are not doing it right. Well, how did I choose them? Why did I choose them? I should have known better. Obviously, the Creator chose who would have been the right people to do the job, right? So even if, let's say, a large majority of people aren't doing it right, Hashem has already made a provision that there would be someone doing it correctly. And how do I know this? Remember that little story in the book of Genesis or in Bereshit that talks about like a city called Sodom and Gomorrah, and in Hebrew it's called Sodom and Amorah. So remember how the whole story that that Abraham understood from the Creator of all things that Sodom and Amorah were going to be destroyed, and that he had a nephew there named Lot and his family. So he goes through this whole process of asking the Creator of all things, if there's 50, in English you say righteous people, but a righteous person doesn't mean anything. In the Hebrew language it would be a tzaddikim. If there were 50 tzaddikim, meaning people who are winning more at doing the right thing more than they're losing. And at that time, it wouldn't have been like the Torah that Jews got at Mount Sinai. It would have been the 7 Noahide laws at that time. So basically what he's saying is, okay, if there's 50 people keeping the Noahide laws in these two cities, would you spare the two cities? And Hashem's like, yeah, if there's 50. But then he starts going down, like, well, what if there's 45? Oh, well, what if there's 40? What if there's 30? And he gets down to one last number before Hashem basically moves on and both cities are destroyed. And it says in Bereshit Yud Het, which is 18, Lamed Vet, which is 32. ויאמר אלונו יחר לאדוני וידברו אף פעם אולי ימצאון שם 10. And that's in the yellow, and this is Avraham speaking, and he's saying to Hashem, okay, well, what, please don't, almost like, please don't be angry. I'm going to ask one more question. If there were 10, tzaddikim, 10 people who were doing the Sheva mitzvot, the 7 mitzvot of Noah correctly in these two cities, would you spare them for 10 men? And it says in the green, Wayomer lo, this is Hashem speaking, Hashem says to him, Wayomer lo ashchit, ba'avur ha'asara. So Hashem says that if there were 10 of them, I wouldn't destroy the city. And we know, based upon the text, what essentially happened was that there weren't 10, that there was only Lot, and his, basically Lot was the only person there. His daughters, got out, and his wife was on the way, but she kind of, looked back, and looking back doesn't just specifically mean she turned around and looked, but it's more like she was thinking about going back, and essentially the whole city, was destroyed, and Lot was the only one who made it out, because he was the only one who was not breaking the Sheva Mitzvah Noach at that time. So what that tells us is the following. Is if in any generation there are at least 10 Jews in a Jewish city who keep the Torah correctly, it prevents destruction. So you could ask, well, how can I say something like that? What I mean is a little bit more than just okay, that city won't be destroyed, because there have been situations where there have been Torah-based Jews who have died along with people in the city, especially during the Inquisitions, during the pogroms, during the Nazis, the time of the Nazis, things like that during the Holocaust. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in every generation, there have been attempts to destroy the entire Jewish people. But until this day, none of them have worked. Essentially, you've had situations where all the Jews in the land of Israel, a group of people tried to destroy the Jews, the Israelis at the time, and they maybe destroy the kingdom, destroy the monarchy, destroy this and that, but yet the Jewish people survive until the present era. How's that possible? Essentially, it's possible because there were always in every generation Jews who were keeping the Torah correctly. Otherwise, there would have been no reason to say, okay, well, keep them here. Allow them to survive, because essentially we can choose our survival or not. If all, the Jews decide not to keep the Torah, then there'd be no reason to have a Jewish people. It doesn't serve any purpose at that point. We can just be like any other people around the world. But essentially what that means is that in every generation, there have been at least 10 Jewish people in every city to basically keep the fact that they're Jews here, keep the Torah here. So Torath Mosheh Jewish communities outside of Israel confirm the accuracy of the transmission. So remember what I was just saying about the whole idea of in every generation there's always been 10 Jews in every Jewish city, for example, who were keeping the Torah correctly, somewhere in the world that allowed the Jewish nation to exist. Here's what I mean by that, more than just a metaphysical explanation of it. What I mean is the following. This group of people in the picture you see here are Torath Mosheh Jews who were from the city of Haban. Haban was in a part of Yemen, kind of like near Aden. Now, the history of how Jews got to Haban and also other parts of Yemen, initially, the first group was pre-exile, meaning that during the first temple period, it's stated that essentially there were Jews who left before the first temple was destroyed, before the Babylonian invasion, and made their way into Arabia, and essentially stayed there, taking with them the Torah that they had at that generation, which at that time would have been from Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah. So the Torah that they received from Jeremiah and his generation and those who were following him, they were basically his students. And they left in order to, because they believed that the prophecy he was saying about the destruction of the monarchy at that time was going to happen. So they left before the Babylonian invasion, went into Arabia. And these men here are descendants of those Jews, as well as they had a community that moved to Israel back in the 1950s that totaled about 450 people at that time. From that particular location. There were other Jews in Yemen, totaling about 50,000 Jews from Yemen that came here eventually over time. So this here is actually was written based upon Yemenite histories of the region, and it basically is dealing with it's called Gidol Peot Bekarav Yehudei Tzafon Hatzi Ha'i Arav, meaning that, and this is the Jewish community of Yemen as well as Arabia, and it's written by Hagi Mazoz. And essentially what's written here, it says Mo'ed Bo'am Shel Yehudim Leteman Ve'nativ She'avru Ben Bo Badarachom. So essentially it's explaining what point did Jews get to Yemen and what path did they use to get there. It says Miyad Acher Shechtav Kalpach, meaning Rav Yosef Kalpach, Ki Gadol HaPeot HaNoheg Od HaTekufat Bet Rishon. Veshe HaYehudi Yehudei Teman שימורו מנהג זה בנכר. הוא הוסיף, מסורת בידינו שאבותינו גלו לתימן בסוף ימי הבית הראשון, כאשר שמעו נבואת ירמיהו על החורבן והמשמש ובו. עמדו וגלו מרצון. תחילה לסביבה הקרובה, ומאוחר יותר לפנים תימן. Then it continues, התארוך של קייפח, ברור, ירמיהו החל להתנבא בשנת 622 לפני הספירה. So essentially, this is about 628, I think, BCE. I think that's the date. I have to go back and look at how the dates work. I keep forgetting how the dates. But basically, during the time of Jeremiah, of Yirmiyahu, that's when this is basically saying that Rav Kalpach explained the history that the first understanding of how Jews got to Yemen was during the time of Yirmiyahu, during the first temple period, and that they believed the prophecy that Yirmiyahu gave for the destruction of the temple, and they left beforehand of their own accord, and went to several locations before they went into Yemen. And it continues, לעומת זאת לא ברור הנתיב שעברו בו היהודים בדרכים לתימן לשיטתו. הוא הסתפק במילים לסביבה קרובה. אך כפי שאראה במשך, סביר להניח שכוונתו הייתה לצפון חצי האי הערב. So essentially what he's saying is that the path that was taken, Rab Kaifach didn't exactly, have that information, but essentially by saying that they were went to a local area that they had been in North Arabia at that time. So Hagi Mazo's article continues on, basically quoting another Rabbi Korach, from Yemen also, from I think a little bit before the time of Rabbi Yosef Kaipach, but it may have been around the time, I forget which Rabbi Korach this was, but he says, Korach hevi Masoret domeh. So he says the Rabbi Korach brings us a similar historical tradition about when Jews first got to Yemen. אך מפורטת יותר מזו שאצל קפח, באשר לנתיב שעברו בו היהודים. This is what, now he's quoting what Rabbi Korach mentioned, because he says Rabbi Korach had a little bit more information about the path that they took to get to Yemen. So he says, המאחרים אומרים כי בחורבן בית ראשון נתפזרו היהודים וגלו לאי ערב לחצוב הצפוני הנקרא היג'אז ולחצוב הדרומי הנקרא ימן, meaning Teman. So what he explains is that there's others who say that during the First Temple period that there were Jews who had been spread out and basically had been left or exiled into Arabia, and they went to an area called Hijaz, and that's basically that. And they also went further south to a place called Yaman, which is Teman, Yemen. כלומר, לשיטת קורח בסביבה בשנת 526 לפני הספירה הנוצרית, לכל המאוחר גלו היהודים מארץ ישראל לתימן. מכוון שהוא כתב כי חלקם גלו לצפון ערב, שאפשר להניח כי לשיטתו, אלא מהם שבאו לתימן, עברו קודם לכן בצפון חצי האי הערב. So what he explains here is that Rabbi Korach is basically explaining a time where the Jews had left during 586 BCE, and essentially had gone into a region outside of the land of Israel, and that basically a section of them went into one direction in northern Arabia, for example, and then that there was some that went further into Yemen, Yemen is in southern part of Arabia. So then this brings us into the two major exiles that happened after the first Commonwealth of Israel, as well as during the time when Israel split into two separate kingdoms during the civil war that had happened, which the northern part being called Yisroel and the southern part being called Yehuda. And essentially, the northern part of Yisroel contained most of the 10 tribes of Israel. But we also know that some of the people from those 10 tribes had actually moved to Yehuda and were part of the region of Yehuda. Now, what essentially happened was the Assyrians invaded the land of Israel in the north and basically took over the land of north and dismantled the monarchy there, as well as the social structure there. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they went around and found every single Israeli they could find, every single of the 10 tribes in the north. They couldn't go to every cave, every river, every hill, every forest and find everybody. They basically dismantled the entire governmental structure of who they could find and deported them to Madi or to other areas. And essentially, for the most part, it's not known what happened to the majority of the monarchy at that time or even number of people. It is known that there were some people who were able to remain in the land. According to some sources, there were some people of that region of Israel who paid a tax and were able to go back. But also during that time, as you see in the red, this is where they were taking the Yisraelim who were in that area out, the 10 tribes out. And essentially the purples where they were replacing them with other peoples, because at the time the Assyrian invasion policy was that you dismantle the government, you take as many people as you can away, move them to a different region and populate them there, and then take people from another place that you've conquered and populate them in the area you just conquered, and then switch them up so that nobody can really have a geographic control anymore. And essentially if whoever's left, it causes tension because they look and say, okay, we don't know who these people are who just showed up here, and it basically either causes them to intermarry with each other and destroys the cultural element of whoever is there first, and it can also cause a situation where it causes tension between the two. Now, what's interesting is the result of that northern invasion by the Assyrians is still felt even today. There are Jews from the land of what's called Kurdistan, who are called Kurdim in Hebrew, who have traditions that a number of the people in their communities were actually results of that Assyrian invasion. They were not lost tribes. They were just simply they were deported by the Assyrians and ended up in Kurdistan and in parts of Iraq, which is now considered Iraq. But it wasn't just like they left and had nothing with them. They left with the Torah, because the Assyrians allowed them to bring the Torah with them. They left with the Torah. They had that generation and continued with that Torah, especially after making contact with those who were in Yehuda, which came in later generations. Now, what you also had was Israelis from that region who made it into Afghanistan, who either were in Assyria for a while, did trade, and went further into the east and went into Afghanistan. And there are Jews, which you see in this picture, who are Afghanistani Jews. Now, on the right, you have fragments of a Torah scroll that came from Afghanistan. Now, one thing that's interesting is within the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a Geniza that was found in Afghanistan, meaning almost like a repository of old Jewish texts that either were no longer used or were old, and they're because they have a high status, they're not destroyed. They're just simply buried or put away to let nature happen with them. And essentially, from that cache of information, they found fragments of Torah scrolls, old Torah scrolls, thousands of years old, hundreds of years old in some cases, and also documents that give histories, additional histories from the time of the first Commonwealth as well as the second one, before the invasion, and that's been found amongst the Afghani Jews. And then you also have the Jews of Kafkaz. So the Kafkazim are a type of Jewish community who were known as warriors, similar to the picture you saw of the Afghani Jews. And they would walk around with knives and swords and guns in some cases, and were known to be strong warriors. But they also had with them the Torah. So they brought the Torah during the exiles, and then exiles from the Babylonian exile, which came later, also made it to that region. And there are Jewish communities here in Israel of all of the three I just showed you: the Qaraim, the Afghanim, the Kafkazim. There's actually areas in this country where the cities in those areas used to originally be all Jews from these different regions. So, for example, I think there's a place called near where I work called Be'er Yaakov, which mostly has a high population of Kafkazi Jews, who are descendants of the people you see in this picture here. And a number of them are actually provided protection during the early parts of the statehood of Israel for different regions like Tel Aviv and things like that. So when you have the Babylonian exile, what you have is a situation where the remaining region of Yehuda, who was able to hold out against the Assyrian invasion, eventually were invaded by the Babylonians. When the Babylonians came in, what they did was they didn't exile the average Israeli or average Yehudi, the average Jew. They went in and exiled just the leadership, the rulership. And this is something that's actually mentioned in Yirmiyahu, because a lot of what Yirmiyahu was making prophecy against was not the average Israeli who was walking around. It was the government at the time. So essentially he was making governmental commentary that the government was not doing the Torah correctly. The average person was, and then some people in government were, but that was the main complaint of his nevuah, and it's mentioned clearly in his nevuah that's what he was talking about. And essentially the government was taken off, and the average person was left behind. That was one of the things the Babylonians did. They came and just took the government away, basically. And the Jews who were taken, they were allowed to keep their culture and keep the Torah there. They were just deported to somewhere else and made to live in certain cities. So essentially, what you have from that exiles, you had Jews who eventually were able to go in another direction and went to Egypt, went to Mitzrayim. And there are Jews here today who actually have family members who were Jews from Egypt, and essentially they had their Torah also. You had Jews that even got as far as China during the Assyrian, but also maybe sometimes during the Babylonian exile. And what is interesting about the Jews of China, of a place called Kaifeng, is they had a synagogue that had 3 of them, I think, in this one region of Kaifeng, that had lasted for a long time, but then maybe a couple hundred years ago, they had been flooded several times to the point where they couldn't rebuild, and they had mixed in with the local Chinese population. Now, one of the things that's interesting about them is that they were left alone in China because of the fact that they did not want to mix in with the Han Dynasty rulership. So the Hans had a big thing about not mixing with other people, and they said, okay, well, the Jews are great because they don't want to mix in, they don't want to take over the government, so put them in positions of, leadership and, government positions. Now, this Torah scroll that you see here to the right is a Chinese Torah scroll. And what's interesting about this Torah scroll is that there were Jesuit priests about a couple hundred years ago who went to China when they heard about there being Jews in Kaifeng. And essentially what they were hoping was that because they believed that these Jews were from the Assyrian exile, they had hoped that they would find Torah scrolls that would support the Christian position of the New Testament, meaning that in areas where a Christian tries to prove that the New Testament quotes the Tanakh correctly, the Torah correctly, but when you look in a Jewish Torah in Hebrew, it doesn't quote it correctly, they said, well, maybe these Chinese Jews here have a text of the Torah that's more pure, that proves the New Testament. But they went away sad because of the fact that the Torah that they found there was exactly like the Torah of Jewish communities in other places. And then you also have Sephardic Jews who end up in Spain, Greece, North Africa, and Turkey. Sephardic Jews, again, in some of these titles sometimes overlap each other, but essentially in later years, Sephardic basically didn't mean the location as much in Spain, which is known as Sepharad, and it's actually mentioned in the Torah as a location. But the exile, according to the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, that took place from Sephardic Jews were Jews who were living in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, who had been exiled there. And I once heard this one rabbi who was saying that the Jews who were known as Sephardim mostly came from the tribe of Yehuda. And then he mentioned Jews that we'll talk about in just a second, the Ashkenazim, were mostly Jews from Binyamin, so the tribe of Binyamin. So the thing is that Sephardim have their Torah that they've kept with them. And, of course, in every generation, they had passed down that Torah and had used the rules of copying that existed in all Jewish communities. And then you also have Ashkenazim, which, of course, anyone who has like a thing against Jews usually brings up Ashkenazi things. And what's interesting about Ashkenazim is that essentially Ashkenazim are descendants of Jews who were once in Sephardic areas or Mizrahi areas who simply moved north. And they simply moved north and married non-Jewish women from there who they converted. And then that's how you built up the Jewish community. But in every location where Jews went, there were always people who converted and joined the Jewish people in those regions. So if somebody gets to the region, like let's say North Africa and Morocco, and there's no wives, they don't have any wives with them, they might convert a woman there and marry her. And then that's how you have a situation where Jews look different in different locations, because at some point there was a mixing, but the mixing being that whoever was not Jewish in the area who was joining the Jewish community went through a conversion called a giyur and married into that community. And over time, you have both native and converted women, maybe a few men here and there, who joined those communities and married into those communities, and then we're all like descendants of like those genetic variations, if you will. But the Torah scroll that you find amongst Ashkenazi Jews, same thing. It's based upon the same process and the same text that when you look at a Sephardic, like a Torah scroll, and you look at any Torah scroll from the previous ones, you see that there's commonality between them. So what this means at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're looking at a Dead Sea Scroll, it doesn't matter if you're looking at an Italian Torah scroll, an Iraqi Torah scroll, a Yemenite Torah scroll, a Chinese Torah scroll, Spanish Torah scroll, and soon we'll see even a Samaritan Torah scroll. You can look at it and say, okay, this comes from the same source material. So what that means is, as I pointed out in previous videos, is that if you were, for example, to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, like this part here of the Ten Commandments, and say, okay, well, obviously, if this is 2,200 years old, there has to be a difference between what is in this text and what Jews have modernly, because this is like something they only found within the last 100 years. But when you look at it, it's not any different. The Ten Commands, I've even read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find the same information that you find in Jewish texts. I mean, the variances are very low, as we'll see in just a bit. It doesn't matter if it's like tefillin. They found phylacteries, as people call it in English, tefillin, that actually go back to that period also. And it's the same as tefillin now, and we'll go over why that's significant. There are fragments of like different like texts. Another one that was found like in the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit later, same thing. The Aleppo Codex, same issue. You find the commonality between texts, and it doesn't matter. They all point to a common ancestor Torah text that was common. So why did I mention tefillin? These are tefillin that you see in the picture, and you've probably seen Jewish men who wear them on one goes on the arm, one goes on the head, and it's wrapped around with these like straps that go around the arm, the forearm to the hand. So why is this even significant? The reason why it's significant is, first of all, if you look in the middle of this page, you see that there's a tefillin that has red letters under it. It says 2,000-year-old tefillin. These are tefillin they found in the Dead Sea area of Qumran, and these tefillin are about 2,200 years old or so. Now, these tefillin essentially have like parts of parchment, scrolls, parts of the Torah in them that are written there. Not the full Torah, but parts of it that have to be placed inside of in 4 separate areas of the box. If you look at the tops of some of these boxes, you see little lines. Those are compartments. So it means that the tefillin in the middle, which are small, had compartments in them with parchments in them from the parts of the Torah. There were sections of the Torah that were written on these parchments in very small lettering. And what's interesting is the same parchments that are used today in Jewish communities were being used back then, more than 2,200 years ago. The same text, the same exact words that are supposed to be there are used in the same placement of those texts. Because, I mean, each the 4 compartments have 4 different sections of the Torah, and they have to be placed there in a specific order according to Jewish law. Well, they did that exactly according to the way it's being done now. They've actually found 2 sets that match the 2 different types that exist even today. So this is the inside of what you're seeing here. So basically, essentially what you have is that when a sofer, who's like writing these, will essentially like write them very small on these parts of animal skin, being the kalaf, and then we'll basically place them in there. So the tefillin from more than 2,200 years ago have the same information, the same writing, and confirm the Torah that was written today. Because again, if it was so different, the writing would be completely different. The text information would be completely different. But a Jew who has good eyes and can look at some of the text written more than 200 years ago in tefillin can read it and say, okay, this is the same thing I've got in mine. In fact, they even put the parchment in the same places we put mine in. The exact same thing. The next thing is what's called a Mezuzah. If you're not Jewish and you're listening to this video and you know someone who's Jewish and you see that on their door, they have like a little case that's there. Inside of that case is a parchment called a Mezuzah. And essentially it's part of the Torah also. And a specific part of the Torah. And it has to be rolled up and put inside, as you see on the right side. It says Jewish Mezuzah case and section of the Torah inside. And also on the left side, you see a Samaritan text, same kind of situation, where Samaritans didn't do it in little on parchment. They did theirs on like stones, like around their doors. But essentially, you see the same process. Somebody more than 2,000 years ago was doing the same thing that's being done today with the same text and same information. And if you compare it to what's written in a Torah, a Sefer Torah, it's the same information. And then you find other fragments in the Dead Sea area, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that also confirm that the text as Jews have it today is the same kind of text that existed back then. And when people talk about the differences, I mentioned this in my previous video, the differences they're talking about, I'll actually show you what those differences are. And you'll see that sometimes in English, they overinflate what they're talking about the differences are. I mean, it's like someone saying, there's a scratch in this piece of paper. There's a huge difference here, when it's just a scratch. So then the other confirmation is that even breakaway groups from Torath Mosheh communities confirm the authenticity. Sorry about that. So there's a breakaway group known as the Shomronim, or the Samaritans, who have their own Torah text. Now there's only about 1,000 of them left nowadays. Half of them live in Israel, on the Israeli side, and half of them live in the Palestinian side. So they have their own Torah text, which has about 6,000 differences between their text and the Jewish text of the Torah. Now, what's interesting is that the 6,000 differences, about 99% of them are just simply word choices of words that either are they chose this word over that word. And, it's like saying someone obviously changed the Torah, either us or them, one of the two. So if you accept that there's only 1,000 of them, and at one point the last Kohen that they had, the last priest that they had from the priestly family of Aaron, who was a descendant of Pinchas, passed away several hundred years ago. And if you look at the troubles that they've had in terms of the fact that they have fewer women than men, they have a lot of genetic problems because of the fact that they've had to enter their own community for like a number of generations because they had not enough women to marry. You can kind of say, okay, well, it doesn't seem like they're doing so well compared to like the rest of the Jewish world. But, again, that's another argument for another time. But what's interesting here is that if you look at their Torah, even though they use a different script, they use what's called a Katav Ivri script, and we use Katav Ashuri script, which simply means that there were Torah scrolls at one point that were written in a similar script to what they use, but their script is more of a modernized script from the last several thousand years. Reading it, you see the same content. And what I mean by that is that you don't see something wildly different from what the Jewish text says. There's like the two major differences they have, where in their 10 Commandments, they basically place in there that the mountain to put the temple on is Har Gerizim, Mount Gerizim, which is where they had a temple at one point. But other than that, you're looking at the same text. It's just a matter of you can look and say, okay, well, somebody rebelled and kind of just made their own little thing up here. It's either the Samaritans or the Jews. That's pretty much what you're left with. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at their Torah text, what is the order of their text? Well, Bereshith, Genesis, as you say, Shemoth, Exodus, Vayigro, Bemidbar, Midibor. Then Vayigro, of course, would have been Leviticus, and also Bemidbar, Numbers, Devorim, Deuteronomy. So with all of the things that happened with them being a breakaway group from maybe about 2,000 years ago, maybe about 1,500, depending on how you understand their history, they still have the same order of text that we do. They didn't change the order. You would expect that somebody would have said, let's shuffle this around a bit. Let's put Devarim first. Moshe Rabbeinu is explaining to the people of Israel what's about to happen. And then he talks about the history of like what happened like way before. And you also expect that some of the stories would have been spun either by us Jews or by them to make us sound better than them. Like, for example, they believe that the Samaritans, that is, they believe that they come from the tribes of Joseph, from Ephraim and Menashe. So I would expect personally that they would make Ephraim and Menashe, and also Yosef, the hero of everything, while we Jews would make Yehuda, Judah, who we come from, the hero and everything. But what we find is that, like, for example, in the story where Yosef is taken Mitzrayim to Egypt, I would expect that, if we Jews changed everything, we should change it so that it wasn't Yosef, because he wouldn't be the hero then, that it was actually Yehuda who was taken. But you don't find those kind of changes. You find that the stories are the same stories. You find that the mitzvot are basically the same mitzvot, and that the major difference you find in the Samaritan Torah is that in areas where the Jewish Torah talks about Hashem as if like Hashem is like a man, but we understand it, that it doesn't mean that. It's like in the language of men. Their Torah actually says what we already understand and believe. It says that, for example, there's a part of their Torah that says Adonai Jibor Milchamo, where our text says Adonai Ish Milchamo. And essentially, when you look at the explanations of what that means in the Jewish text, it says Adonai Gibor B'Milchamo. So their text literally is written what we already believe about it. It's just that our text is written in the way that we say it's the language of men. We're not saying that Hashem is an ish, that he's a person, he's a man. This is simply the language that men understand. It's like no different than saying that the creator of all things is our father. Avinu Hashemayim. Well, obviously he's not our father, like in the way we understand it, but this is a way to look at it. For example, a human way of looking at it. Now, the next breakaway group is the Qaraim the Keroites. Now, different than the Samaritans, the Keroites actually have the same exact Torah text that Jews have. There's actually no difference between our text and theirs. So essentially, this is like saying, okay, their only disagreement is about the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. But other than that, a Karaite text is exactly the same as a Jewish text, a Torath Mosheh Jewish text. And they will probably take offense to me saying that, talking as if they're not Jews, but whatever. They're Karaite Jews. So you can call them that. So what differences exist between community Torah scrolls? So this I presented in a previous video. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. There are about 14 differences between Torah scrolls, between Yemenite Torah scrolls and other Torah scrolls, for example, from Europe. And included in the Yemenite, you can sometimes include Iraqi Torah scrolls, because there are Iraqi Torah scrolls that are similar to Yemenite. So essentially, the differences are listed here. That, for example, in one place, you have a situation where a word shows up in the Torah in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit, and it's spelled, for example, in one way in the Yemeni Torah scrolls, but it's spelled a little bit differently in the next one. And this same kind of like spelling exists in these 14 places, and this one also. But the interesting thing is in the first one, for example, is we'll look in just a second, it's pronounced exactly the same. The second one that we're looking at now, same thing. It's pronounced actually the same. It's just a matter of there's a helper letter that was placed in the other Torah scrolls that didn't need to be there. So you could say that, okay, someone down the line either took away the letter or added it one way or the other, but it's still pronounced exactly the same. Now, the biggest difference between these two scrolls, and this is like the main one, is that one of them has Vayiyu Kol Yemei Noach, where that's the Yemeni one, where in the and that's from Genesis about Noah, and in the other ones it basically has like Wahi. So the major difference there is just kind of like saying like it will be versus like it was or something like that. But in some cases it means exactly the same thing, which is spelled differently. But the change isn't like that different, so the difference isn't big. So here is in the Yemeni scroll, the word potifara is one word with no space between the two separates, like potifara. Where in the other scrolls, it's like two separate words rather than one, but it's pronounced the same, potifara. But it's just like one of them has it like right next to each other, the other one has potifara. So same thing. One of them, the space is either there or it's not in the original Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. Same thing here. Both words are pronounced exactly the same, ta'aseh. So one is spelled with an extra yud in there, and one is not. Efod. They're both pronounced exactly the same. One of them has the helper letter, one of them doesn't. Now here, it's not shown here exactly, but in the Ashkenazi scrolls here and the other scrolls that are mentioned on the left side, the first two letters from the right side, starting the right, are larger than they are in the Yemeni. In the Yemeni, they are written just as you see it here on the right side here. And we'll go over exactly what this means for those who don't know Hebrew, because I know I'm going through this kind of fast. So the same thing exists here, where there's like some differences in like things like where the spacing actually took place in the sentence, for example. Same thing. There's like where something's open. It's like a spacing issue of where the text has like the paragraph, for example, start or end. Same thing here. There's a helper letter. In one text, it has the helper letter. The other text it doesn't, but they pronounce exactly the same. Helper letter, it pronounced exactly the same. One has the letter, one doesn't have the letter. Same thing here. Helper letter, it has the letter, doesn't have the letter, pronounced exactly the same. Here I think there's like a size issue. Here, and here this is like the next one. That's like a minor but kind of major one. The Yemeni one has docho with a pronounced like with a aleph at the end, and the other text has a docho with a hey. And both words mean about the same thing, but one is like a little bit more extreme than the other, but they mean basically the same. So let's look at this just a little bit closer. If we look at this closer, and we compare Yemenite Torah scrolls, which Yemen was here, and Torah scrolls from Europe up here, the differences would have been basically like this. In the Yemenite Torah scroll, the word Menasol would have been written this way. And the word Menasol in Ashkenazi, or in other European-like texts, would have been this one here. The only difference being this red letter on the left is added here. But the pronunciation is exactly the same. If you add the nikudot, meaning the vowels, in both texts, when you see them written, they are pronounced exactly the same. Menasol in the right side of the Yemenite text on the right, and Menasol in the left side. The only difference you could say maybe is just like the O is maybe a little bit longer on the left side because it's called Holom Wob. Holom Wob is pronounced just a little bit longer than the other one on the right side, which is another dot without the marked letter you have marked in red right there, and it's just Menasol, where the other one might be Menasol. But other than that, they're the same word, the same pronunciation. None of these changes change the meaning of the text. And the next type of difference would be just in the Yemenite text, you may have a word where it's like Ze Sefer, and in the European ones, you may have Ze Sefer. Pronounced exactly the same. The only difference is that in one text, the one of the letters called the Samech is bigger than it is in the other one. But again, doesn't change the meaning, doesn't change the pronunciation whatsoever. So what this means, this actually means that with a total of over 300,000 letters, or approximately 79,000 words, making up a Torah scroll. A kosher Torah scroll has to have this amount of words and letters. In the last 2,500 years, only about 14 minor differences have crept in. 14 minor differences within 2,500 years of Jewish communities being, in some cases, completely separated from each other, or only partially, but having a situation where nobody's willing to give up their Torah scroll. So, for example, even today, if you were to tell like someone in a Yemenite synagogue, hey, throw that Torah scroll yours away and use this one from like Poland, they would say no. If you went to a Polish Jewish community and said, hey, take this Polish Torah scroll, throw that away, and use this Yemenite one, most of them would say no. Unless there's some like reason you can prove to them that this text is superior, and even if they did do it, the differences are only 14 differences. And there's actually a Rabbi Yaakov Sapir, who went to Yemen, and when he looked at these like 14 differences, he thought, oh, the Yemenites made a mistake here. Let me correct this. And the interesting thing is that when he went to Europe, he found out that the 14 differences that he thought were mistakes in Yemen were actually the way they used to do them in Europe. And funny enough, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, they actually found a Torah scroll in Europe that was like one of the oldest ones, complete Torah scrolls they found in Europe, and it's actually similar to the Yemenite one. So that means that, possibly, quite likely, that the Yemenite text may be the most accurate one there. But again, that's up for debate. But 14 differences where most of them are just like a helper letter, but not a change in pronunciation or meaning for the most part. That's a pretty good track record if you want. And also, what's interesting is the process came from Hashem. Hashem put that in place and gave it to people to do. So Hashem chose the right people to be able to make it so that basically within the time of the exiles, that only 14 differences would creep in, and then when all the Jews are back in the land of Israel, or where quite a few of us are back in the land of Israel, you can analyze these differences and say, wow, that is a pretty good accomplishment for have scribes in different countries who've never met each other, never got to talk to the other guy, and were meticulous enough to where they were using this process that was several thousand years old to keep the text accurate. So another check of this is systematic reviews of the Torah scrolls. So you may ask, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by systematic checks of the Torah scrolls? It's one thing if somebody just has a Torah scroll and once a year you pull it out and you read it. In Jewish communities, that's not the way it works at all. In Jewish communities, there are certain days of a regular calendar week in a month where we are reading the Torah scroll. So let's say you have a synagogue that only has one Torah, or even like let's just say one for the moment, because most synagogues have more than one that they purchase. So essentially, what you have is this: let's say it's September 2021, and we have on Thursdays. Regular, and this mark here is denoting a regular time of any day of any week of any month when a Jewish man goes to a synagogue and we read from a Torah scroll. So on Thursdays of the week we read from a Torah scroll. This here is the Shabbat. the Shabbat, the Sabbath, or as some Ashkenazim call the Shabbos. So on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, there's a special reading of the Torah that happens of the entire, what's called an entire parasha. It's an entire section of the Torah. And every Saturday, every Shabbat, for an entire year, the Torah scroll is read from start to finish, from Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy, the beginning of Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy, from Rosh Hashanah, essentially from Sukkot to Sukkot. We read the entire Torah, like from start to finish, for a scroll. And then, like, for example, we rewind it all the way to the beginning and read it again every year. And throughout the week, we're reading different sections of it. So that means that here, we've read, in this first week, we've read that Torah scroll twice. During the regular part of the week, we've read a small section. During Shabbat, we read that whole section. So then the next week, on Monday, we read it again. Now, this particular calendar, we have Rosh Hashanah during this year, and this is outside of Israel, where it's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Well, actually, everywhere it's Rosh Hashanah for 2 days. But, for example, on Rosh Hashanah, there's a special reading of the Torah on the first day. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, there's another special reading of the Torah. And then when Rosh Hashanah is over, now here comes Thursday again. So we read the Torah according to the regular cycle again. On the Sabbath, we read that, not just that small section that was read during the part of the week, an entire section on Shabbat. The next week coming up, same thing, same process happens. I missed a few days earlier. Sorry, the order was a little off here. So what this means that during just this part of the month, you have a situation where in this month, for example, we've read that Torah scroll. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 times within this week, we've read that Torah scroll. And that's just in 1 month. So what that means is that if we go through this and go through a whole year, if there are any mistakes in the Torah, we're going to notice them at some point. And interestingly enough, I'll have to put like a link in it. There's a guy who did a video that I just noticed recently where because of Corona, they had been reading the Torah outside, and it happened to rain one day, and they had like this kind of tent thing over like where they were reading. But it just so happened that a drop of water spilled off the tent and landed on their Torah scroll, on its one particular word. And someone not thinking, like tried to take something to like kind of like get the water off to dry it, but it actually smeared the ink that was used on the letter. So immediately at that point, when that happened, their Torah scroll is what's called pasul. Can't be used. It has to be corrected, and then it can be used again if it can be corrected. So they took the Torah scroll, they rolled it up, put it back in their special place, and pulled out another Torah scroll and continued reading with that other Torah scroll. He actually took that Torah scroll to a sofer in New York City, someone who whose job is to write Torah scrolls and correct them, and had him look at the thing that had happened. Interestingly enough, what happened was when the sofer looked at the Torah scroll, he looked at the word that the drop of water had fallen on, and the word that it had fallen on was incorrectly spaced, meaning that there were like two words that were essentially like put together when they were supposed to be spaced apart. And this guy was saying that it was amazing. So that the sofer fixed it, and they had not, he said, they had the Torah scroll for 5 years and been reading from it, had not noticed that mistake. But within 5 years, an event happens, which he was saying for them, it was like a miracle. The fact that this one drop of water on this one day was raining falls on the one place in the Torah where this mistake was found, and allowed us to be able to go and correct it when our Torah scroll is now kosher. But what happened was that means for 5 years they were using a Torah scroll that couldn't be officially used without knowing it because they missed this one thing. But this one tiny event happened that made them stop, put the Torah scroll away, and then have like a person who's trained to go and correct it, only for him to find, oh, the space of this word is not spaced correctly. This Torah scroll's been pasul, it's not kosher this whole time. Now we can correct it, and now the Torah scroll's back in circulation, and they'll continue to read it over and over again. And if there were any other mistakes, they'd be able to find it because of the continuous process of checking. Now the next verification is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which will say Dead Sea Scrolls versus Torah Scrolls versus Masoretic text. So before I begin this part, this is one of the things that the person who influenced this video brought me to, it's hard to explain without showing visually. First of all, a Torah scroll is not a Masoretic text. I'll say that one more time. A Torah scroll is not a Masoretic text. As I mentioned in a previous video, if you look at the top, this is a Sefer Torah. This is from a Torah scroll from the book of Genesis, Bereshit, the first few lines of it. So what's on top is a Torah scroll, an official Torah scroll that can be used in a synagogue. It's written on Jewel. It's a Yemenite Torah scroll, and so Genesis 1, verses 1 through 2. The bottom one is a Masoretic text. Now you'll notice little marks that are on the bottom one, and you'll notice that the words aren't all in the same places. The bottom text is a Masoretic text, which means, drum roll, that it has vowels and punctuation added to it. If it doesn't have vowels and punctuation added to it, it's not a Masoretic text. If it has punctuation and markings on it, it can't be an official Torah. It can't be a Sefer Torah used officially. So that's the big difference. When people sometimes who try to bring up things against the Jewish community as we change the Torah, and they say, well, the Masoratic text is incorrect. Well, but first of all, Masoratic text is not a Torah scroll. Masoretic text is like a personal use document. If someone brought a Masoretic text to a synagogue and wanted people to read from it officially, they wouldn't do it, because you can't use a Masoretic text with vowels. The Torah scroll has to be without vowels and without punctuation. In order to read it, we have to know the rules of the grammar, which allow us to understand what's there and how to read it. Now, in the previous video, I also did something where I kind of compared a Dead Sea Scroll to a Torah scroll. Again, to show, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were before the time of the Masoretes. You look on the Dead Sea Scroll right here, you see that there's no punctuation added to it. And I was able to go through and read what's on this Dead Sea Scroll and know that it's from the book of Genesis, and it's got holes in parts of it because it's an old section of Torah. And because of the fact that the scribe who wrote it was writing it for personal use and not for an official use, you can look at it and tell it's not an official Torah scroll. It's a personal use. It's called a chumash. Where essentially just for someone to have the text, you can do certain things with it that you couldn't do with an official Torah scroll, just to get the information out there. Now, if you remember in the previous video, and I had a mistake at the bottom of that one, where if you look at the difference between the two, essentially, as I showed before, you look and, okay, this is a little out of order than what I wanted, but you can see these two sections are the same. As I showed in the previous section, there's a part here that was missing because of the gap, because of the fragmentary nature of this text. This part here is the exact same stuff. So if you look through these scrolls, what you find is the same thing I mentioned in the previous video, where you have a situation where the differences are those helper letters that I mentioned earlier. And this is the ones that sometimes people make as if, oh, these huge differences. Well, I looked at some of them and said, well, that's just a helper letter. I can still read that. I know what the word is. The only major difference is the one you see in the bigger rectangle somewhere in the middle now that has additional information, because the right side is the Dead Sea Scroll, the left side is the Masoretic text. But again, it's not something that's completely different. It's just simply explaining the Sabbath. The section that we're looking at that has that rectangle there, for example, is talking about the Sabbath, the Shabbat, the Shabbat, but it's simply just mentioning more information about it, that is actually in another part of the Torah. So it means that whoever transcribed the Dead Sea Scroll just simply added another line there to deal with that. So in conclusion, what we see here is that the proof, as we provided earlier, is that the existence of text, Jewish text, all over the world, where Jews were exiled, where Jews traveled to, where Jews landed, and maintained their Torah text, and maintained the Tefillin, maintained the Mezuzot. In every one of these situations, these are the proof texts behind what we're saying, that the Torah of today is the Torah that was given by the Moshe Rabbeinu Amram at Mount Sinai. As Jews, we always know that Torah texts that are several hundred years old are usually copied from Torah texts that are previous to it were several hundred years old also, as the process I mentioned earlier. It'd be one thing if we Jews were saying our Torah is old, but we don't know how we got it. And we don't have any idea whatsoever who transmitted it to who and how it got through the generations. There's a lot of people around the world who can tell you this is an old text, but we have no idea how it was transmitted to the current era. We Jews know that. We Jews have the information, as I showed earlier. The information of who transmitted it to who is common. And you can, in fact, there's even more individuals involved. I just included a short sample because there's a lot of Jewish communities that have at least about, I would say, like 5 or 6 families who have genealogies that can track back, meaning records of genealogies. We have Jews who can trace their genealogy to King David. We have Jews who can trace their genealogy back to Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. We have Jews who can trace their genealogy back to Aaron, the priest. We have Jews who can trace their genealogy to different, people mentioned in the Tanakh, because of the fact that those ancestries were being practiced and kept, in those communities. So essentially, back to what I mentioned earlier, with a total of about over 300,000 letters, and approximately 79,000 words, in the last 2,500 years, only 14 minor differences have crept in, which can tell you that within the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, from the time of Mount Sinai until now, essentially you're looking at, if you wanted to say an average based upon 2,500 years, at the most you'd maybe looking at about, let's say, 15, maybe 20 differences in helper letters, within about 79,000 words and about 300,000 letters. That's a pretty good batting average, and that means that the process Hashem put in place is perfected, and it's a good process, and it hasn't been lost, it hasn't been destroyed, and it wasn't kept incorrectly. Because again, if the creator of all things has the ability to create a universe, he also has the ability to choose the right people for the right job. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I thank you for listening, and I know this is a lot longer than I thought it would be, but I hope this video helps out. Take care.